Elijah King had spent his entire life believing in faith, family, and righteousness. As a pastor in a quiet Florida town, he wasn't just respected, he was revered. People traveled from all over to hear him speak. His sermons were powerful, his faith was unshakable, and his words moved people to tears. He preached about honesty, devotion, and the sanctity of marriage. He believed in loyalty. He believed in trust. And most of all, he believed in family. Elijah had built the perfect one. His wife, Naomi, was a very image of grace and virtue, the kind of woman who made other wives jealous and husbands wish they had married differently. She was kind, patient, and loving, a dedicated mother, a preacher's strongest ally. Together, they had 5 beautiful children. Abigail, 16, the smart and ambitious one. Elijah Jr., 14, the quiet and reserved one. Noah, 12, the playful and energetic one. Sophie, 9, the gentle and kind one. Micah, 6, the baby, innocent and adored by all. Every Sunday, their pew was full. The picture-perfect family, dressed immaculately, sitting in the front row. But perfection is often an illusion, and illusions, they don't last forever. It started with something so small, so harmless, that no one suspected it would set fire to everything they had built. A school project. One evening, as the King family sat around their oak dining table, sharing laughter and stories, Abigail cleared her throat. "Hey, Dad, I was thinking, for my biology class, we're studying genetics, and I thought it would be fun if we all did a DNA test together." Elijah smiled. He loved Abigail's curiosity. "That's a great idea, sweetheart." "Yeah." Noah chimed in. "Maybe we have royal blood." Elijah laughed, nodding. "Maybe we do." But as he reached for his glass of water, something changed in the room, a shift so subtle it could have been missed. Across the table, Naomi stiffened. Her fingers clenched around the fabric of her dress. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to speak, but then she didn't. Henry King, Elijah's father, the family's moral compass, sat at the head of the table. His expression remained unreadable. For a moment, he simply stared at Elijah. Then, slowly, he sipped his coffee. Naomi let out a nervous chuckle, shaking her head. "I don't know, Abby. These things aren't always accurate, and they can be invasive, a strange word for a simple family project." Elijah turned to her, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "Come on, Naomi. What's the harm? It'll be a fun family activity." She hesitated. Then, finally, she forced a smile. "All right," she whispered. If Elijah had paid attention, he would have seen it, the flicker of terror in her eyes. But he didn't, and that was his first mistake. The DNA kits arrived a week later. They laughed as they swabbed their cheeks, sealing their samples and mailing them off. It was supposed to be a game. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, the email arrived. Abigail excitedly gathered everyone around the computer. "Come on, Dad. Let's see our roots." Elijah smiled as he clicked the link, opening the ancestry page. The room buzzed with excitement. Naomi stood behind them, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Henry wasn't there. At first, the results were fascinating. European roots, some traces of African and Middle Eastern heritage. But then Elijah noticed something. His smile faded, his brow furrowed, his finger froze on the mouse, and then he stopped breathing. "Wait." The room fell silent. Elijah squinted at the screen, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. This says I'm not a match to any of the kids as their biological father." A cold chill ran down his spine. No one moved. No one breathed. A nervous laugh escaped his lips. "That's impossible. That has to be a mistake. Right? He turned to Naomi, and that was when he knew, because she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the door, as if she wanted to run. Elijah clicked again. The screen flickered. His chest tightened. There was another match. Someone else in the family was the biological father of his children. Elijah's hand trembled as he scrolled down, and then he saw it. A name. Henry King. His father. The room spun. His stomach lurched. This had to be a mistake. But deep inside, something primal told him it wasn't. He turned to Naomi. Her face was white. "Tell me," Elijah whispered. Naomi shook her head violently. "It's wrong," she stammered. It has to be wrong. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Henry, standing in the doorway, calm, silent, and smiling. Chapter 5. The Confession That Broke a Man. Elijah grabbed the DNA results, his breathing ragged. "You need to explain this. Now." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. Her lip quivered. Then she collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. And she told him everything, every sickening detail. How Henry had manipulated her. How he had started early in their marriage, using his power over her. How she had felt trapped, powerless, afraid. How every single one of their 5 children was not Elijah's, but his father's. A cold hand gripped Elijah's heart. He staggered back. The room closed in. His vision blurred. He opened his mouth to speak, but there were no words. Because how do you describe the moment you realize your entire life was a lie? That your own father had stolen your family? That the children you raised, the children you loved, were not yours? And that the woman you trusted above all else had kept it a secret? Elijah couldn't breathe. Something inside him snapped. The preacher was gone. The husband was gone. The father was gone. All that was left was a storm, and it was about to break. The night air was thick and suffocating. Elijah King sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned bone white. He had lost everything. His faith, his family, his identity. It wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation. He had preached about honesty, about trust, about God's plan. But what kind of God would allow this? The children he had raised and loved were not his. The woman he had trusted above all else had hidden the darkest secret imaginable. And the man he had looked up to had been the devil all along. Henry King, the man he had admired, the pillar of faith in their community, the man who had sat at his dinner table, held his children, led prayers, and taught about morality, had been sleeping with his wife, had fathered every single one of his children, had stolen his life right out from under him. Elijah's mind raced, replaying the moment Naomi broke down and told him the truth. He forced me. I tried to stop it, Elijah, I swear. But I was afraid. I didn't know how to tell you. Years. 5 children. Every single day, knowing but saying nothing. Naomi had been a victim. He knew that. But that didn't erase the betrayal. The secrecy. The lie. Elijah's breathing grew heavy. His vision blurred. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. He had always been a man of faith. But tonight, there was no forgiveness. Only vengeance. The house was silent when Elijah returned home. Naomi sat in the living room, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had been crying all night. When she saw him, she sat up quickly, fear flashing in her eyes. "Elijah," she whispered, "please, I know you're angry. I know this is... Don't." His voice was low, cold, emotionless. Naomi flinched. Elijah stepped closer. "How long, Naomi?" he asked. Her lips trembled. I told you. It started early in our marriage. He said if I told anyone, he'd destroy everything, and you let him." Elijah snapped, his voice booming through the room. Naomi sobbed. "I didn't know what to do. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was protecting the kids." "Protecting me?" Elijah laughed, a dark, hollow sound. "You let him sit at our table. You let him pretend to be a grandfather to his own children. You let me believe they were mine. Naomi dropped to her knees, clutching his hands. I love you, Elijah. Please, we can fix this. But fixing wasn't an option. Elijah's eyes were empty now. His heart had turned to stone. Before Naomi could say another word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. The first stab came fast. Naomi's eyes widened in horror. The blade sank into her chest, tearing through flesh and bone. Her scream echoed through the house. She tried to crawl away, her blood pooling on the floor, her hands clawing at the carpet. Elijah, please, she gasped. But he didn't stop. Each stab was fueled by years of lies, deception, and betrayal. You should have told me, he shouted. You should have stopped him. The knife plunged deeper. Naomi's sobs turned into choked gasps. And then silence. Elijah stepped back, his chest rising and falling, the knife dripping red in his hands. Naomi lay motionless. The woman he had loved, the woman who had stood by his side for years, was now just a lifeless body on the floor. But his rage wasn't over yet. There was still one more person who had to pay. Henry King, the true monster. And tonight, Elijah would make him suffer. Henry's house sat on a quiet street a few miles away. Elijah drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel. His father had no idea what was coming. When he arrived, the house was dark. Elijah didn't knock. He kicked the door open. Henry sat in the dining room, a cup of tea in hand, his Bible open in front of him. He looked up. Elijah threw the DNA results onto the table. Explain this, he growled. Henry's eyes flicked to the paper, and then he smirked. That smirk broke Elijah. You knew I'd find out, didn't you? Elijah whispered. Henry sighed, shaking his head. Son, you don't understand. Don't call me that. Elijah lunged forward. The knife plunged into Henry's side. The older man gasped, stumbling back, clutching the wound. You stole everything from me. Elijah roared. Another stab. You destroyed my family. Another stab. You made me love children that were never mine. Henry collapsed onto the floor, blood soaking through his shirt. His face twisted in pain and horror. You deserve to feel the pain you inflicted on me, Elijah growled. And then he did something even more unthinkable. Elijah grabbed Henry's throat, forcing him to look into his eyes. And with one final brutal act, he made sure his father would never violate another woman again. Henry King's screams filled the house. Then silence. When the police arrived, Elijah didn't run. He sat on the porch, his Bible in his lap, his clothes soaked in blood. The officers approached cautiously. Elijah looked up. It's done, he said. God's justice has been served. The officers handcuffed him, walking him to the patrol car. One of them hesitated, then asked, Where's your wife? Elijah sighed. She betrayed me too. Inside Henry's house, the officers found a horror scene beyond words. Back at the King household, Naomi's lifeless body lay in a pool of red. 2 crimes. One righteous man turned executioner. The town of Willow Creek had always been quiet, a place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors greeted each other by name. But everything changed the night Pastor Elijah King turned himself in, his clothes soaked in blood, his eyes void of the faith he once preached. News of the murders spread like wildfire. Whispers filled church pews. Congregation members struggled to comprehend how their beloved preacher had become a killer. He was always such a kind man, a man of God. How could he do this? But behind closed doors, some weren't so quick to judge. If what they're saying is true, I would have killed Henry too. That wasn't a man of God. That was a demon in disguise. He took everything from Elijah. What choice did he have? Some saw Elijah as a murderer. Some saw him as a man pushed too far. But one thing was certain. His trial would be one of the most shocking in history. And when the truth came out, it would leave the entire country speechless. Sitting in the cold, gray interrogation room, Elijah King showed no emotion. His hands were cuffed, his Bible resting in front of him. Detective Mark Talbot, a seasoned officer who had seen monsters before, studied him carefully. But Elijah didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had already died inside. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Talbot asked, his voice steady. Elijah exhaled slowly, and then he told him every sickening detail: the betrayal, the DNA results, the confession, the rage. And then, in a calm, unwavering voice, he described how he had killed Naomi, how she had begged for her life, how he had driven to his father's house and made him suffer. Detective Talbot's stomach twisted. Most killers showed remorse or denial, but Elijah showed neither, only cold certainty. "He was a monster," Elijah said simply, meeting Talbot's gaze without flinching. "You would have done the same? Would he?" Talbot wasn't so sure anymore, and that terrified him. When Elijah's trial began, the entire country watched. News stations called it "Fired the Preacher's Revenge," a trial of faith and murder fire. Some called him evil. Others called him a victim of unbearable betrayal. The courtroom was packed with journalists, former congregation members, and strangers drawn to the chilling story. The prosecution argued that what Elijah did was premeditated, brutal, and inexcusable. Yes, he suffered betrayal, but he did not act in self-defense. He had a choice, and he chose violence. The defense told a different story. This is not just a case of murder. This is the case of a man who had everything stolen from him: his wife, his children, his faith, his very identity. Can you imagine waking up one day and realizing that your entire life was a lie? Psychologists took the stand. They described Elijah's mind as a shattered maze, twisted by rage, grief, and a sense of justice that had been ripped away from him. Some jurors wiped tears from their eyes, because who could hear this story and not feel his pain? But the prosecution struck back hard. Pain does not justify what he did. He didn't just kill them. He butchered them. The jury was left with a question that haunted them. Was Elijah King a murderer, or a man who had finally snapped? And when the verdict came, the entire world held its breath. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge's voice was solemn as he delivered the sentence. "Elijah King, you have committed acts of extreme and unjustifiable violence. While we recognize the betrayal you suffered, the law does not permit personal vengeance. You are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Elijah did not react. He simply nodded, as if he had already accepted his fate. But his last words in court sent a chill through everyone in the room. "The real crime here isn't what I did. It's what was done to me. You're punishing the man who ended the monster, not the one who created him." The courtroom fell into silence. Some people in the audience nodded. Others looked away, because deep down, they weren't sure he was wrong. With Elijah in prison, his 5 children were left alone. They had lost their mother, their father, and the truth they thought they knew. The state placed them into foster care, each one struggling with the horrific truth of their origins. Abigail, the one who had started the DNA test, refused to speak for months. Elijah Jr. began questioning God, asking how faith could allow such evil to exist. Micah, only 6 years old, kept asking when his parents would come home. The world moved on. The case faded from headlines, but the scars remained. A family once built on faith, shattered beyond repair. And Elijah King? He spent his days in a prison cell, reading his Bible. Some say he found peace in Scripture. Others say he never truly escaped the demons inside him. But the real question? Was Elijah King the villain or just another victim? And if it were you, sitting in his place, would you have done anything differently?